I told Noah. Okay, here we go. Okay. Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. I am really pleased and honored to host my very dear friend, Professor Noah Feldman of the University of Harvard, the world-renowned Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law, widely regarded as one of America's foremost constitutional experts. That is right after myself personally. It's a close second, though. We've known each other for more than 3 decades. We're dear friends. I would even use the Hebrew expression Yedidei Nefesh, soul friends. Before we begin, and before I talk about Noach's brilliance and this particular book, which is of interest to me more than even some of his other great books, because of the Jewish character of the book, let me just say, Professor Feldman is unlike any academic you've ever met. Although he revolves in the highest classes of intellectual discourse and at the crossroads of Western intellectual dialogue, he is a mensch. He is very down to earth. He is very approachable, which I think has made him one of America's most highly regarded public intellectuals. But as a friend, he's a dear friend. He's a loyal friend. And Noah, thank you so much for joining us.
Shmuley, thank you so much for having me. As you say, we go back more than 30 years to when we would sit and try to learn, the two of us with our heads together over a volume of Talmud in Oxford, and it's a pleasure to see you here.
So this new book, To Be a Jew, and I want to get the subtitle right because it's a beautiful subtitle, a new guide to God, Israel, and the Jewish people. That kind of sums it up, the 3 pillars of the Jewish people. This really is a departure for you, not from your core interests. You, of course, did a very famous piece about Jewish identity in the New York Times Magazine that sparked months of conversation and debate that was called Orthodox Paradox. But in terms of the books that you've been writing that have mostly been in your field of inquiry, which is law, this is a departure. Why did you write it?
I wrote it because as my kids started to gradually approach the process of, God willing, going to college, I found myself really struck by how different the world they were going to encounter was going to be from the one that I had encountered more than 30 years ago now. And as you know, I've been running a program on Jewish and Israeli law at Harvard Law School now for some years, about a decade now. And so I've been thinking deeply about a lot of the issues that I ended up writing about. And I realized when I went to think about what I thought that my views weren't exactly the same as they were, 30 years ago when I was, a student when we first knew each other. And I thought it would be really valuable for me personally to try to put those ideas down on paper and to pass them along to the next generation, if and when the next generation might choose to read them.
So you're saying first and foremost it was for your own children. Now, how have things changed? Look, Harvard's been in the news, and not for the best of reasons. It is in the national annual rankings. I think Princeton may come out first in terms of an undergraduate degree. Harvard, of course, is right up there. Who can really judge? But certainly when it comes to graduate courses, it is America's most prestigious university, but it's been all over the news because of anti-Semitism and Claudine Gay, et cetera, et cetera. Is that part of why you wrote this book? Do you think that Jewish students
No, it
like your
actually
kids are
isn't.
gonna? Sorry.
It actually isn't because Shmuley, I don't have your talent in getting a book out the door as fast as you do. I started working on this 3 years ago, and I had a full galley ready to go when October 7th happened. And then I did substantial rewriting in the wake of October 7th to make sure I was sensitive to the moment. But no, I didn't know any of those things was going to happen. What I was really thinking about was how Jewish life, especially for young people, has changed because the real topics of issue and controversy have really shifted so much. And some of that has come out very clearly after October 7th. But to put it mildly, I had no anticipation of what was going to happen.
Well, that's interesting because it couldn't have come out in a more prescient time. You got a Time magazine cover story. Congratulations. I mean, that's unbelievable. And it speaks to 2 things. First of all, how much they respect you. And you, of course, write for Bloomberg and so many other more public publications as opposed to just academic publications. But more importantly, it speaks to the issue itself. So this is not a book about anti-Semitism, which is interesting. But how does the world since October 7th change these 3 pillars of God, Israel, the Jewish people? I'm sure you've been asked this as you're interviewing for your book.
Well, in certain respects, the changes are real. In others, the basic principles are the same. So in the section of the book about God, I talk about how the fundamental structure of what it is to be a Jew, no matter what kind of Jew you are, is that you're engaged in a loving struggle about what it means to be a Jew and what it means for a Jew to exist in the world. And I point out that the very word Yisrael, Israel, comes from the story in the Bible where Jacob struggles all night, wrestles all night with a being who sometimes is called a god, sometimes is called God, sometimes is called an angel, sometimes is called a man. So we won't solve the theological question of what or who it was. But then at the end, that being blesses Jacob and says, your name is no longer Jacob, your name is Israel, because you have wrestled with gods and men, and you have prevailed. Now, of course, it's not possible to prevail against God, but it is possible to be able. The Hebrew word is vatuchal. And I like the translation of be able. You struggle and we're able. So in that section, you can see that people's struggles about what it means to be a Jew are really enhanced after October 7. I don't know a single Jew in any country in the world who hasn't really doubled down on trying to figure out what it means to feel Jewish and to be Jewish. And for some people, that's meant a closer affiliation with Jewishness than ever before in their lives, a kind of Jewish rebirth. For other people, it's been more ambivalent. They may feel very Jewish, but they feel very anti-Israel, and that's a different kind of struggle that they're engaged in. So that part of the book, I think, is really affected by October 7. The middle part of the book is about Israel, and there I try to talk about how Israel has come to play such an absolutely central role in the lives of all Jews in recent years. And I think October 7 really brings that out. You know, if you're pro-Israel, you're more strongly pro-Israel today than you ever were, and you have to be. If you're critical of the government while still supporting the country, you're probably more critical of the government than you were before. And if you're one of those Jews who has trouble reconciling any support for Israel with your Jewishness, you're struggling too. You're struggling to try to differentiate yourself from Israel. So that's also a section that's been very affected. And the last point is, in my section on Jewish peoplehood, I say that the Jews are like a family. Our peoplehood is like a large, very loving, and somewhat dysfunctional family. And that is very much on show. Every Jew feels a familial relationship to every other Jew after October 7, and every Jew outside of Israel feels a familiar relationship to Israel, whether you want that familial relationship and you love it and you support it, or whether you're very upset about that familial relationship. Because the bottom line is, and I'll close the point with this, families are where we find our first forms of love, but they're also where we find our first forms of struggle. And so a familial relationship with other Jews and with Israel is necessarily one that is both of love and also of struggle.
Well, if you were planning to write this book and did most of the writing before October 7th, now the conversation has actually shifted that so much of Jewish identity and Israel, and even our wrestling with God, how, with God watching October 7th, as these women were gang raped, as their literally as their breasts were cut off and played as if with a beach ball by these Hamas terrorists. So much of it switched to anti-Semitism. In fact, I have seen you come under tremendous fire as a world-renowned academic who people would expect to be impartial. You're now being accused of justifying a genocide. Now, people will use words like that to simply attack. Have you found that you and your book have now been dragged into this whole debate about anti-Semitism? The UNNC, United Nations Security Council, this morning just passed its first ceasefire resolution that for only the second time in recent American history was not vetoed by the United States. The last time that happened was when our mutual friend, Samantha Power, in the waning days of the Obama administration, did not veto resolution against Israel's settlement. So this is the second time. It's a big deal. Are you being roped into that? Is it changing your thinking? Is it clouding your ability to focus on the issues, God, Israel, the Jewish people, now from a very defensive posture, how the Jews are going to fight against and resist anti-Semitism?
Well, we've known each other for a long time, and Shmuley, that God willing, I am a strong believer in the idea that the reason to be a Jew is not because of the anti-Semites. To me, anti-Semitism is a very important topic. It's important to struggle with it. It's important to explain what's bad and wrong about it. And I tried to do that in the article that you alluded to. And I try to do that where I talk about anti-Semitism in the book. But this is a book about the affirmative case for being a Jew. And to me, it's not true what Jean-Paul Sartre said, and it's not an accident that he wasn't a Jew when he said this, namely that the anti-Semite makes the Jew. That to me is a sacrilege against the Jewish tradition, in which it's the relationship with God and with the other Jewish people, or with spirituality, however you choose to understand it, that makes the Jew. And
And
it's
yet, someone who was a Jew, Spinoza, said the exact same thing hundreds of years earlier, that without anti-Semitism, the Jews would disappear.
well,
And
that's a different point to say that, and that's a sociological claim. I actually think it's not true, um, but it's a sociological claim. Whereas Sartre was trying to say that the essence, the existential essence of the Jew is the anti-Semitism. And then by implication, if there were no more anti-Semites, forget about there wouldn't be Jews predictively. He's saying there would be no need for there to be Jews. And I don't agree with that. And I know you don't agree with it either. So what I've tried very hard to do in speaking about the book is to focus on those positive aspects of Jewishness, the familial aspect and the spiritual aspects of Jewishness, because those are why people should be Jewish and should care about being Jewish. You know, Shmuley, as you know today, if you go to college and you don't want to be a Jew, you can just choose not to be. For the great majority of Jews, they could pass and choose not to be Jews at all. And there's not going to be anyone to
you
stop
really
them
think
from
that's
doing
still
that. And I
possible?
don't want people to do that.
Okay. We're in agreement. Okay, so let's just go through those three subjects. God, I totally agree with you about this idea of struggle. For me, it's even struggle about not whether or not God exists. I think Jews have almost an affinity. I think it was Elie Wiesel. He may have someone else who said that Jews are religious without even knowing it. We have this affinity connection to God, even if we kind of try to suppress it. And most Jewish atheists, as it were, are very aggressive atheists, like Christopher Hitchens, who I used to debate all the time. Very aggressive in their atheism, almost like they're trying to suppress perhaps even a natural inclination without going into the more spiritual side of that. Then there's Israel. Well, let's go to Jewish identity for a second. Noah, I couldn't agree with you more that I wish Jewish identity was something positive. I want to be a light unto the nations, like the prophet Isaiah said. I want to know that we brought the world ethical monotheism, the idea of one God, which actually translates into the unity of all mankind. If there were all these different gods and there's Hera and Aphrodite, then women come from one place and men come from a different place, maybe they can never really stay married, maybe nations can never really get along. That unifying theme of a one God actually means we could be one human family. Then you have the Ten Commandments, ethical monotheism, this idea of an unbridgeable law that, Hamas terrorists can say all they want. Well, we were forced into attacking Israel because of Gaza being the world's biggest concentration camp. I think that's a tremendous lie. But as Alan Dershowitz, your predecessor in that position of Friedrich Frankfurter professor, once said, look, the Jews after the Holocaust didn't go around blowing up German nurseries, right? So it's not true that even if persecution were real, that it must lead to the immoral actions of a terrorist. Having said that, I fear that the positive aspects of being Jewishness are being completely overwhelmed by this fight against anti-Semitism, and it's the only thing that really kind of animates the Jews today. It's the ADLs. And I look at my own life and I say to myself, Noach, when I knew you, I taught Torah. You and I studied Talmud together. We played squash together. I used to beat you easily. Then you started beating me after a month. I remember that every time I still go on the squash court. But we really saw Judaism as a light unto the nations. We brought a lot of non-Jews to Oxford to Shabbat dinners, and they loved it. There was no discussion of anti-Semitism. To the contrary, the Jews were very popular. We brought some of the world's best speakers to Oxford. We had 5,000 paying members. That couldn't happen today in a place like Harvard. That couldn't happen in Princeton, where a Jewish organization would actually attract thousands of non-Jewish members. The Jewish students, I think, are probably very hunkered down, feeling very, if not persecuted, which is perhaps too strong a word, very visible. And noticed and awkward. So don't you feel that tragically fighting the darkness of anti-Semitism has now superseded spreading the light of Judaism?
Well, let me push back a little bit using your own amazing efforts and successes in Oxford for the other side. When you arrived in Oxford in the late 1980s, Oxford still had what I would call the old-fashioned anti-Semitism. It also had some of the new anti-Semitism, the leftist anti-Israel anti-Semitism. But there was also just good old-fashioned, we've been here for 1,000 years. No Jew was allowed through the gates of this university until a century ago, and even then.
Isaiah Berlin being the first, correct, yeah.
Yeah, so that was real and it was alive. It wasn't a matter of ancient history. And what you said, which was very much not the norm among British Jews at the time, was we're going to promote what's great about Judaism and we're going to bring interesting speakers and we're going to have community and we're going to have, the spirit of Hasidism, even for people who aren't themselves observant Jews. And in that combination of factors, you were able to bring in thousands of people, many of whom, especially those who were British, would never have dreamt of attending a Jewish event, much less signing up and actually joining a Jewish organization or a Jewish group. And you did that, I would argue, and this is certainly the message that I took away at the time, by emphasizing all the affirmative things that Jewishness had to offer: faith, intellectual debate, openness, spirit. So I think that that remains the answer. Now, am I saying we should put our heads in the sand and ignore anti-Semitism? Absolutely not. It's crucial to call out anti-Semitism. It's crucial to fight against it. It's crucial to explain what's wrong and what's bad about it. And that's why I've been writing about it and talking about it. But that needs to be kept differentiated in our minds from why we are doing what we are doing, and from what in the long run will keep young Jews committed to Jewishness, open to and interested in Jewishness. What will bring people to Jewishness is its inherent value. And let me just add a last point about this, Shmuley. We're coming up to Passover, and there's a line in the Passover Haggadah, the kind of script for the Passover story, that I've always struggled with, and I think I have a better understanding of now. And that line is, in every generation, they rise up against us to destroy us, but the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hands. Now, in the past, I used to be worried about that because I wasn't crazy about the idea that it's inevitable, that there will always be anti-Semitism. And also, I was more interested in our relying on ourselves than relying just on divine direct intervention, which is what the literal meaning of that text says. But when I think about it today, I think the message is a little different, at least for me now. And the message to me is anti-Semitism is not something you can do anything about at a fundamental level. There will always be some forms of anti-Semitism that some people hold. What saves the Jewish people from anti-Semitism is something that is internal to the Jewish people. It's the Jews' own relationship with God and our own efforts to make sense of God and to live meaningful Jewish lives. And in that sense, it makes sense that we say that on Passover, because the Passover ritual of telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt is the archetypal, the most basic Jewish way of expressing our commitment, our beliefs, our continuity, and our commitment to the social value of, as you say, ethical monotheism, of the idea that you must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So that's where it's not that the anti-Semitism was going to go away. It's not that it doesn't have to be fought. It's that we cannot allow that to swamp our affirmative commitment to our Jewishness.
Well, I agree with all of that. But if the anti-Semites don't give the opportunity to be heard, and if you just feel you're under threat, then the positive aspects of Jewishness, let's just look at what the world sees as positive aspects. The world reveres the Jewish family. We didn't have a homeland for 2,000 years. The kitchen table was our homeland. The world reveres Jewish community. For hundreds of years, Jews were more valuable than gold, quite literally, if they were kidnapped by pirates. Now we see the hostages in Hamas and what Israel will do 1,000 to 1 to get them back. Because if you were a pirate and you stole a Jew, you could redeem him at any port to a Jewish community, very strong sense of community, our relationship with God, the Bible. Christianity is the most successful idea in the history of the world in terms of how many people have embraced it. It's based on our Bible. We can't even talk about those things right now, Noah. That's why I welcome your book, because here's a world-renowned professor saying that this is where the focus should lie. But a lot of people would say to you, Noah, come on. They're after us. And as Yogi Berra famously said, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
They are. They are, Shmuley. I mean, that's true. There are people out there who hate Jews. There's no question in my mind about it, and they need to be addressed. But also notice that we have multiple platforms, and we can speak about both things. We can speak about anti-Semitism, and then, I just published this book, and thank God for the first time in my life, I have a book on the New York Times bestseller list. And that's because people are also
Is that
interested
this
in
week? Is that this week?
just this week, yeah.
What number?
It's number 14, so it may not be a jug or not, but I'll take it.
Well, by the way, that's incredible.
Well, it's very fortunate, thank God. But the key point that I'm trying to make is that there's room for both, because right now, and maybe always, it's hard to stop Jews from speaking. We're capable of expressing ourselves in many, many different forms and in different registers and in different tones, and we can do both. We can do both. We can talk about anti-Semitism because it's important to talk about, and we can also remember that there's more to us than the way those who hate us would try to define us.
Yeah, but I'm personally, I have to tell you, now I'm speaking to you as a friend, I'm personally finding it very difficult to do both. I have spent my life trying to teach the world about Jewish sexuality because I think Jews always had a very, very healthy, unlike other religions, a healthy relationship with sexuality. I'm a child of divorce. We want to keep marriages together. If erotic desire is lost, you're in a prison cell. If you don't want to be in a marriage and if you're not attracted to your spouse, your kids become your jailers, right? And a lot of people bought into that. And other books that I've written, I'm finding it very difficult to veer away from the fight from anti-Semitism, which leads me to the question about Israel now. You and I both know that it's a little bit complicated and maybe debated among scholars, but essentially, Herzl's idea of Israel was twofold. Number one, every nation needs a land, and the Jews need a place to call home. But more importantly, he did not seek Israel out as the place for the Jews to have a home. He sought Israel out as a place for Jews to end anti-Semitism. He thought that if the Jews were removed from European society, first of all, we would stop grading against the non-Jews for whatever reason we were. And secondly, by proving to them that we are capable of self-governance, they would respect us more. Instead, Israel now seems to have become this locus of anti-Semitism. I utterly reject the idea that the Jews are hated because of Israel's actions in Gaza, or name any war you want to before that. But I absolutely believe the opposite is true, that Israel is hated because it's the Jewish state. But whatever the reason, while I revere the memory and legacy of Herzl, if that was his stated intention, then you have to say that he failed. So what do we do? Israel, I'm very dedicated to Holocaust memory, as you well know, Noah, and was very close to Elie Wiesel. The Holocaust happened for two reasons. The Jews had nowhere to go. No one would take them in, like the farcical Avion conference, which met for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And no one took anyone else in. Breckinridge Long was in charge of all visa applications at the State Department, was an out-and-out anti-Semite who was later fired essentially by Congress because of his anti-Semitism. He only allowed 80,000 Jews came into the United States through the 6 years of the Holocaust. I venture to say that more people may have crossed the Rio Grande last night. Okay, undocumented, there's a difference, but still. But the Holocaust happened because we had nowhere to go and we had no army. Now we have a place to go, Israel, thank God. We have an army, and October 7th still happened it happened in the Jewish state, and it happened with the IDF. So what does Israel mean to us today?
Well, I think there are two ways I would think about that. And let's go back to your Herzl formulation. In the one instance, the Herzl vision was successful because there is a Jewish state, and it does have an army, and it is a sovereign state. At the same time, we know today what was very hard to know in the waning days of the, Austro-Hungarian Empire, that in a world of global superpowers, it's not enough to be an independent state. You also have to have global superpower allies, and you also need to protect yourself very intensely. So Israel exists, and it is a homeland for Jews where Jews can go when they're persecuted elsewhere. And it needs the support of the United States, and it will for the foreseeable future because of the way geopolitics evolved. It turns out there's no place that is completely capable of functioning without the support of global superpowers. So Herzl's vision was correct insofar as it was possible to anticipate the way the world evolved, and it was a little different in the way that the world evolved. And Israel has not only an army, but nuclear weapons, and that still doesn't guarantee its full capacity to protect itself, because there's no way to use the nuclear weapons in a conflict like the one between Israel and the Palestinians. So that's on the first aspect. On the second aspect, what I think maybe it was impossible to imagine fully in Herzl's day is that the narrative of Israel is an outgrowth of the narrative of the Jewish people. And here, Herzl was in the grips of a nationalist idea that I think you and I would probably have said, even if we lived at the time, was wrong. Namely, that the Jews were, because they were a nation, they didn't have to be a religious group. They didn't have to have a core faith. They could just substitute the national identity of being an Israeli for the historical religious identity of being a Jew. And if that happened, then the thought was there'd be nothing for the world to be angry about, and people will respect the Jews. But that's not what being Jewish is. It's much more complicated than that. It has multiple parts. And so in consequence, since the narrative of Jewishness didn't disappear, and it can't disappear as long as Christianity and Islam exist in the world. Christianity has almost 2 billion adherents. Islam is not that far behind. So you're talking about, say, 3.5 billion people, or maybe a little more in the world, whose religions are formulated in relationship, sometimes oppositional relationship, to Judaism. So the narrative's not going to go away. And by the way you know that that's true is if you go to China or India, no one really cares about the Jews very much at all. It's not a major topic of interest, maybe at the periphery, because they don't come from traditions where the Jews are at the origin point. So for that reason, Israel took on, and I talk about this in the book, Israel took on a lot of elements of the old Jewish narrative. It took on some of the positive elements, and from the standpoint of anti-Semites, It took on all the negative elements. And that's why it's always going to be the case that just as anti-Semitism isn't really about Jews, it's more about the preoccupations that people have that they project onto Jews. Similarly for Israel,
which predates Israel. Okay.
predates Israel. Similarly for Israel, lots of forms of opposition to Israel that exist today come out of preoccupations that people have that they're projecting onto Israel. They'll say that, Israel is white supremacist, for example. Well, Israel isn't white supremacist because the Jews were not considered white until very recently, and that, in any case, would only cover Ashkenazi Jews. And
No, you met my father at Oxford. My father was
yeah,
not white. My father was brown. My father was from
exactly.
Iran.
And that was his identity as well. So the metaphor, the model rather, doesn't work well. But people have this concern about white supremacy as a real global problem, which it is in the United States, and they project it onto Israel. And so that's why those things are still there. And that's why they're not likely to go away. And on that dimension, I think Herzl was too idealistic. And also he imagined that you could have Israel without Jewishness. And I don't think that was not realistic, and it didn't play out that way. Israel is a much more religiously Jewish place today than it was in 1948, when no one imagined that the attraction of the Jewish tradition would last. They thought that Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy, Haredi Judaism were dead because of the Holocaust. And instead, they're engaged in an extraordinary renaissance because of the power of their ideas and the fact that they have lots of kids, and people want to live that way.
There's two questions that we have 6 minutes. There's 2 minutes, two questions I want to focus on. Number one, you're not used to being unpopular. By that, I mean, you're used to being unpopular, perhaps among some Republicans after you were chosen by the Democratic Party to serve as the chief legal witness it was the first Trump.
Impeachment. Yeah, they didn't like that very much.
Okay.
And when I used to write about Islam and democracy, Shmuley, people were also mad at me. Some people said I was soft on Islam. Some people said I was too hard on Islam. Like I am a little bit accustomed to it, but it feels different when it's
true. But because of your academic eminence, you're not used to being too unpopular because you can defend your position extremely well and you write very academically sound books. Now, because you've emerged, Time Magazine cover story, and now number 14, congratulations. That is a big deal. Now you're emerging almost for some as a locus of this hatred. I've seen you attacked. Are you comfortable with that they're saying that you did come out as pro-Zionist in this book, and that's enough to have enough people hate your guts, right?
Well, look, no one can say, well, I can't say with truth to you, and I would never lie to you, that I like when people are really angry at me, or that I like it when people misrepresent my views. But it's also part of what it is to try to put ideas out there in the world. And it's also the case that, as you say, there's some things that one believes that one stands up for, and other people don't like them, and that's the way that it is. So I'm doing my best. We're not as young as when we first knew each other, and I'm trying my best to be able to stand by what I believe and remain calm in the face of whatever criticisms I get from wherever they come, and to try to say what I genuinely believe. And I said in the article very clearly, it's not that I think that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but I do think that some of the criticisms of Israel that we're hearing do verge into anti-Semitism. And I don't want to apologize for those aspects of Israeli policy that I don't like, but I don't think that there is at present anything like evidence that would legally satisfy charging Israel with a genocide. I think that's wrong, and I think that point of view probably reflects in many cases an unconscious anti-Semitism, though there may be people, especially I will say Palestinians themselves, who might feel that way without any anti-Semitism, but I still don't think that's correct.
I'm actually amazed when I debate those who make that charge, how they can't even define, genocide. Genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, 1947. I hate the word race, so let's stay away from that. Ethnicity, side, mass murder. So it's the mass murder of a group specifically. So of course it's not a genocide, because Israel would have started, God forbid, with its 1.9 million equal Arab citizens who live in complete peace if they were after a group. But be that as it may, Noah, we have to get to the core question of what the future holds, because here you are writing about the definition, you're inquiring into what all this means, the Jewish relationship with the God of Israel, Jewish identity, Jewish pride, Jewish existence, and finally what it all means in terms of having the first Jewish state. And yet again, so many Jews are saying, wait a second, anti-Semitism. You're saying Sacht was wrong. I agree with you. But Jews are in shock, Noah. We got 3 minutes here. Jews are in shock at the resurgence of anti-Semitism. So I have to given that you want to bring these three themes together, I have to ask you this one question. Is God playing some sort of strange game with the Jews? You're the chosen people, but you're going to be hated for 2,000 years. Even when you get a state, you're going to be hated. Even when you get a state, you're going to have to die in order to protect it. It's not that I want to go into the reasons for anti-Semitism, but I do want to remind you that you and I were on a panel. I think it was the last time that Elie Wiesel, the most famous witness to genocide, who ever lived, we were on a panel together at NYU. You were there, and you remember that I pushed Elie Wiesel. You were on the stage, and I said, Professor Wiesel, I called him Rabbi Eliezer, you don't believe that non-Jews are inherently anti-Semitic. And I was shocked by what he said. He was probably 85 at the time, and he said, he quoted the Talmud. He said, halacha shesonel Esav Yaakov. It is an axiom of faith that Esau hates Jacob, the non-Jewish nations hate Jacob. So I was in shock, because this is a man who won the Nobel Peace Prize, the French Legion of Honor. And then when I pressed him and said, not you, not like to Elie, not you. I mean, you are loved by the non-Jews. And then he said to me, if you remember, halacha biyadua, he added that word. It is known, well known. How do you react to that? Will non-Jews listen to the message of your book, or is there an inherent bias that we can't explain that's never going to go away?
Your question includes two different questions, and let me try to address them both in the couple of minutes we have left. The first is a question, I'm going to reverse the order. The first is a question of whether anti-Semitism is somehow inherent in the nature of the world. And the second is about whether God is, to put it your way, playing some elaborate game with us. On the first, I would say, given the history of Islam and the history of Christianity, it's hard for Christians and Muslims to have no feelings whatsoever one way or another about Jews, but real progress is indeed possible. 50 or 60 years ago, before Vatican II, almost all Christian denominations embraced a version of Christian theology that was supersessionist and in a lot of ways anti-Semitic. Today, almost no denomination of Christians officially adopts that view. That's a huge example of progress that's taken place in our lifetime. And as you know, Shmuley, because you go and speak to Christian audiences all the time, there are many Christian audiences that are completely open to hearing and respecting a rabbi and a rabbinical voice, and that just would not have been true in the past. So progress is possible, and it's not inevitable, but we're talking about a lot of complexity given the history. On the last point, the point you were raising, Shmuley, about God, I remember very vividly a story. This happened before I came to Oxford, but I remember that you stood up on a chair in Oxford and in a Hasidic fashion called out in protest against God for the horrors of the Holocaust.
Yes.
And that's because the nature of the universe is such that we cannot fully understand God's judgment and God's will. I will say that if you read the Bible and you look at the rabbinical interpretation of the Bible, the consistent theme is that God chose the Jewish people and he holds them to a higher standard and he punishes them severely, and they can lose everything up to and including their homeland, which they lost twice in Jewish history, even when they were brought into that homeland